Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight. To my classmates, to Dr. B, I'm so sorry. I have COVID. I tested positive this past week, so this is not my normal preference for presentation, but this is what it's going to be tonight. I'm super thankful to have a willing audience joining me on Zoom, but I'm going to go ahead and pray and get started. Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to open your word. Lord, I ask that our minds and hearts would be open to what you have to teach us tonight, that you would just speak to us through your word. Lord, we know that you are always teaching us, that you always have something for us. And God, we just ask that you would prepare us to receive that tonight, even in the midst of a pandemic and less than ideal circumstances. God, you are at work, and we trust that, and we want to see that. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Yeah. All right. So if you guys want and you have a Bible nearby, or if you have your phone with the Bible app, or if you want to run and grab it right now, we're going to be in Nehemiah 2 tonight. So it's going to be the first 20 verses. Nehemiah is kind of in the middle of the Old Testament. It's right before some of the chunky ones like Job. And Psalms. So if you hit Psalms, go backwards a little bit and you'll end up in Nehemiah. So as you are grabbing your Bibles, getting ready to look at Nehemiah 2, I want to tell a brief story tonight. It's actually part of my own personal story. I think my audience here may have heard it before, but I'm gonna share it twice, and I'm gonna share it slightly differently each time. So just be listening for the differences between the two times that I tell it. So when I was a freshman in high school, I learned that summer I was going to have the opportunity to go on a mission trip to Haiti. And I was really excited to be a part of helping people and traveling. I had never done any of that before. And I had some really amazing opportunities during that week. I got to meet a lot of people. I got to be part of a VBS at an orphanage. I learned some words in a new language. It was an amazing experience. I loved every second. And then I got back to the US, and in the weeks following, I was just trying to find out what I needed to learn from that experience. And there was one night that I remember in particular. I woke up in the middle of the night after a vivid dream, and I just heard so clearly that I needed to pursue a degree in missions. And I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I knew that that's what I needed to do. So that's the first time that I told that story. I'm going to tell it a little bit differently now. So just be listening for kind of what the difference is between the way I told it the first time and the way I'm going to tell it now. So when I was a freshman in high school, I found out that God had allowed an opportunity for me to travel overseas and be part of what he was doing in another country. And that country was Haiti. And when I got to travel on that trip, it was a week-long trip, and there was so much I saw that God did during that week. God brought many people into our path for us to learn from them, for them to learn from us. God allowed us to be part of a VBS at an orphanage. God allowed our hearts and minds to be open to a new culture and a new language. And there was just so much work that he did throughout that week that it was just amazing to watch and be part of. And when I returned from that trip, I was seeking the Lord. I wanted to know what he had for me from that experience. And God is faithful. He always is. And there was a night, a few weeks after we returned, that I woke up in the middle of the night, and God said to me so clearly, I want you to pursue a degree in missions. And that was really kind of a turning point for me. So I don't know if you noticed kind of the difference between those two tellings of part of my testimony, but there was kind of a difference in perspective. The first time that I told it, I was really telling you my story, what I saw, what I felt, what I heard, what I did. But the second time that I told it, there was much more of an emphasis on what God did and what God shared with me and what God allowed me to be part of. And it's really interesting how even the words that we use to tell a story can kind of betray some of our perspective on that story. So we're going to actually go ahead and dive straight into the text. We're going to read these verses from Nehemiah. I haven't given you any background. You don't have any context. But what you do have is the knowledge that our perspective can really change how we tell a story. And so as I read this out loud, I want you guys to be paying attention to, what is Nehemiah's perspective? Is he telling it like I told it the first time, or like I told my story the second time? How is Nehemiah telling this story to us? What is the perspective? So I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then I'm going to see if you guys can help me out afterward. So Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 1 says, "In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and I gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, 'Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart.' Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, 'Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire?' Then the king said to me, 'What are you requesting?' So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it.' And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, 'How long will you be gone, and when will you return?' So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, 'If it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah, and a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy.' And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went out by night, by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, and I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. Then I said to them, 'You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision.' And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, 'Let us rise up and build.' So they strengthened their hands for the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, 'What is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?' Then I replied to them, 'The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem.'" So what I want you guys to look at in Nehemiah 2, verses 1 through 20 that we just read, I want you guys to look through and see in the times that Nehemiah is speaking to someone else in this story, when he's talking to the king, when he's talking to his opposers, when he's talking to any of those people, I want you guys to look and see what perspective he's using to share that story. So maybe just look through and find some of those verses where he's talking to someone else, and I just want to hear what your observations are.
Nehemiah has a very strong focus towards authority. He is loyal to the king, but he's loyal first to God. And he's saying, even when he's about to say something to the king, he prays to God first, like a short prayer, and then he's talking to the adversaries, and he says, "Well, you have no claim here; it's God's claim here." So they're all throughout this chapter. the Nehemiah is always pointing back towards God and God's authority and God's calling on his life.
Super cool. Thank you. Yeah, so really the big thing that's cool about this passage is watching how Nehemiah is always pointing back to what the Lord has been doing. He does carry this as a weight of a work that he's been called to, but he always points back to the Lord as the person who put that on his heart in the first place. All right, so that was just an introductory activity to our passage. So I'm going to go ahead, and now that we've read our passage, we've noticed Nehemiah's perspective and the way that he's always pointing back to the Lord and what God is doing. I'm going to go ahead and give you some context for what's happening here, because we just kind of drop in the middle of the story in Nehemiah 2, and Nehemiah is just bringing some wine to the king. So let's find out kind of what's happening here. It's always important to know how this fits into historically what was happening at the time, but also just the whole narrative of Scripture. How does this kind of fit into that? So I don't know if you guys noticed when you were flipping through to find Nehemiah, but right before Nehemiah is a book called Ezra. And in our Bible, these are two very separate books. In my Bible, it has the big letters for Ezra and then big letters for Nehemiah. They seem like very separate things, but actually originally these were just one book, and they were kind of telling a unified piece of the story. And so it's important to know what happened in Ezra for us to be able to know what's happening in Nehemiah. And so kind of a little bit of history of what's happening here in these books. God's people have been living in exile for a long time. They've been living away from the land that God appointed for them, that God saved for them. And that's because the people had been disobedient. This was actually something that God had promised to them, that if they obeyed him and they did what he had called them to do in his law, that he was going to provide for them, and there was going to be all these blessings associated with that. But if they disobeyed, there were going to be certain curses and consequences that came with that. And one of those things was not being able to live in the land that God had chosen for them. And so the people did disobey, and that did come true. And now they've been living in exile away from the land and under the rule of other people groups for generations now at this point. So they've kind of even gotten a little bit comfortable with that, living outside of the land and under the rule of different people. It started with the Assyrians, really, and then the Babylonians, and now there's an empire called Persia in charge. And that's the empire that King Artaxerxes rules over, and Nehemiah is actually his cupbearer. So he brings the wine to the king, and probably even is tasting it before he gives it to the king to make sure it's not poisoned. So he had a pretty important job, and he's with the king of this big, important empire, Persia, on a regular basis. Yeah, so when we look at the book of Ezra, which is really kind of part of the book of Nehemiah, that part of this story is about God's people rebuilding the temple, starting to worship him again in their land that God had provided for them and appointed for them. They had gone back, they'd returned, they were worshiping in the temple. And there's also this heavy focus on, okay, the reason that we got kicked out of the land in the first place is because we disobeyed God. And so if we're back in the land, we need to obey God because that's what he's called us to. And so this guy named Ezra is reading them the law and kind of encouraging them to follow the law in the ways that they failed to do so before. So then when we get to Nehemiah, now we're back in Persia. In Ezra, they were in the land, they were rebuilding the temple, all that. So now we're to Nehemiah. And if you look at chapter 1, he's asking, hey, how's everyone doing in Jerusalem? And he gets this report that, oh no, the wall around the city is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire. And not only is that kind of a disaster in terms of safety, it's also a little bit of a disaster because everyone else is saying, that those Israelites, those people living in Jerusalem, they're a little bit of a mess. They don't even have a wall. It's all broken down. And so there's just kind of this shame that comes with it, but then also this kind of logistical disaster of, oh no, our city doesn't have a wall. So we have this problem that has two pieces. So what I would love for you guys to do, knowing that background, that context, this is where Nehemiah is. He's just heard really bad news. I would love for you guys to look real fast at Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 4 through 11, which is right before this passage, and just to yourselves make a list of character traits of Nehemiah that you see, because this passage, Nehemiah 1, 4 through 11, is actually a prayer that Nehemiah is praying to God. And I think that when we're talking to God, that's when people can see our character the most. So before we even start taking apart this narrative in chapter 2 that we're looking at, I want us to see, okay, who is Nehemiah? What are some of his traits? Because that's going to be really important for kind of the main point of what we see in chapter 2. So just take like a quick minute or two, write down some character traits. We're going to make a master list together so we can kind of have those available to us as we look at chapter 2. So go ahead. Maybe give me like a hand signal when you're finished so that I know. I don't know what this is, but it's a hand signal. So this is probably a more logical hand signal than this, but this is where we are. B, are you hand signaling to me or are you just eye signaling? Okay, there's a hand signal. Great, okay. Do you guys want to share some of the character traits of Nehemiah that you see in chapter 1? And then if we're going to make this like that game where you have to cross off your answers if other people say them first, that's what it's going to be. So any leftovers I have after you guys share, I will share as well. Don't everyone go at once.
He's very well versed in at least the concept of Moses and the law.
I said he was empathetic towards the hurt of other people. He's mourning for the people of Judah or Jerusalem.
That's good.
He's confessional as well.
Mm-hmm. I wrote down repentant, which is kind of in a similar vein. Just gonna do a little slash there.
He trusts God.
I had that one as well. I also put honest, because before he even starts praying, he sits down and cries for days. Any further?
His identity is very much wrapped up in being an Israelite and being a follower of God.
Cool. All right, so we're just going to keep those character traits kind of in front of us as we're If I had a whiteboard, I would write them down behind me so that we could all kind of have access, but I don't have a whiteboard. I'm stuck in my room because I have COVID. So we're just going to have to make the best of this situation. So keeping in mind Nehemiah's character traits, we're going to look through Nehemiah chapter 2, and I'm even going to give away the main idea to you guys because I want you to be tracking with me as we're looking through this passage. And the main idea of what we're looking at in chapter 2 here, after we see Nehemiah's prayer, after we see his character here, is that when we live in obedience, we see God's provision in our lives. And the reason it's important to sit with Nehemiah's character in front of us as we read this passage is because we're going to see that all these character traits that we just talked about are part of Nehemiah's obedience to the Lord and living in a way that God has asked him to live. So, keeping that in mind, when we live in obedience, we see God's provision in our lives. We're going to look at the first 4 verses of Nehemiah 2 to find out Nehemiah's first obedience, and then we're also going to see God's first provision in line with that obedience. So when we look at Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, we already read the whole chapter, so I'm not going to read the whole thing again, but I am going to summarize just a little bit. We see Nehemiah here. He comes into the king, and the king, the first thing he says to him is, "Why are you so sad?" Because it was just so evident in Nehemiah's face. And so the first obedience that we see in this passage is Nehemiah's honesty with his emotions. And I don't think that honesty with emotions is just something that we can see as obedience in this passage here, because I'm actually reading through the book of Job right now in my own time with the Lord, my own quiet time every morning. And the biggest thing that we see in that book is Job being so honest with how he's feeling to the Lord. And honestly, it can be a little bit like, ooh, sometimes when you're reading through it, because you're like, dang, Job, did you really say that to the Lord? Like, that's a little bit, oh, I don't know if I really want to hear about that. That's a little too honest maybe for me. But at the end of the book, Job has these friends throughout the book that are trying to give him the answers why God has allowed all of these hard things to happen to him. And Job keeps saying, no, we can't figure this out. It's just hard. Why, God, are you doing this? And so it almost seems like the first time I read Job, I was like, why do we talk about him like he's this awesome guy? But you get to the end of the book and you realize that what God was asking from Job is honesty with his emotions. He says to Job's friends, my ways are higher. You can't possibly understand why I'm doing what I'm doing because I'm God and you're not God. He said, Job is righteous because he stuck with it and he was honest with me and he trusted me even though he didn't understand 100% what was going on. And I think we see that here with Nehemiah as well, is that he's honest with his emotions. And in this case, God provides almost a parallel to what we see in God's own character. We know that God desires honesty with our emotions with him. But also in this case, God provides in that the king, King Artaxerxes, this king of a pagan nation that doesn't even know God, he wants to hear Nehemiah's honest emotions. He wants to know why Nehemiah is sad. And so the obedience in this part of the passage is that Nehemiah was honest with his emotions. And then God provides in that he sends the king to care about Nehemiah's emotions and ask him, hey, why are you sad? Like, what's going on in your life right now? So when we look at that and we see, okay, Nehemiah was honest with his emotions and God provided the king to listen and care about what Nehemiah was feeling. When we look back at this list of Nehemiah's character traits, what do we see in this list that we made that lines up with what we see in these first 4 verses? Let me phrase that more clearly. Which of Nehemiah's character traits kind of lead to the obedience that we see in this first part of the passage? Do you guys have thoughts?
We mentioned it earlier, the honesty of Nehemiah and the commitment to God. Also, he's not afraid to be sad. And he's not afraid to be honest about his sadness.
Mm-hmm. It's really good. I think sometimes we're afraid that sad is a bad emotion or something that means we're doing something wrong. But really, God desires for us to be sad before him and honest about that. So yeah, you're right. We did write down honesty as one of Nehemiah's character traits, and I think that we see that here, leading to his obedience to be honest with his emotions. Okay, so verses 1 through 4 are about Nehemiah's honesty with his emotions and the king's desire to hear why he's feeling that way. But then we're going to move to the next 4 verses, verses 5 through 8. And we actually move past the king desiring to hear why Nehemiah is sad and what's going on. And Nehemiah starts to share with him, this is what I want to do about why I'm sad. And he actually lists a lot of things specifically. This is what I want. He says, I want to go back to Judah. I want to go to Jerusalem. He says, can you please give me some letters to the governors of the places I'm going to travel through? And can you give me a letter to a guy who's going to provide me with materials to do what I need to do? He has a list of what he wants. And so when we look at this part of the passage, the obedience that we see from Nehemiah here is that Nehemiah asks for help from the king. And that's a hard thing to do sometimes. I think sometimes we think that asking for help means that we're showing weakness or something like that. But here, this is an obedience that God is asking of Nehemiah to request help from this king who doesn't even know God. But then we see the provision come through because every single thing that Nehemiah asks for, the king agrees to and gives to him for this work that God has called Nehemiah to. So the second obedience is that Nehemiah requests help from the king, and the second provision is that the king provides the help that Nehemiah asked for. So again, when we go back to our list of Nehemiah's character traits that we just made, what of his character traits do we see in this obedience of requesting help from the king? I think we can see the empathy that Beth was talking about, because he's doing this because of something that's bigger than himself, and he knows that. This isn't just, Nehemiah's city that he wants to rebuild because he feels sad about it. This is a bigger thing, and he's carrying the weight of all of those emotions. Anything else?
I didn't say this when we were writing down the list, but I put humility as one of his character traits, and I think this would come into play here since he's humbling himself before the king and God.
That's really good.
I was going to say trust because it goes from verse 4 to verse 5, and then I prayed to God, and then he immediately talks to the king. So he's going to God first and requesting that God gives him what he needs, and it worked. God provided.
Yeah, that's really, really good. Really, really good. So again, here in this part of the passage, we see the character of Nehemiah is a man who follows the Lord and a man who's after God's heart. And so we see again this second obedience from him, that he requests help from the king, and then we see God's provision come in that the king provides exactly what Nehemiah had asked for. So just a quick recap, verses 1 through 4, Nehemiah is obedient in honesty with his emotions. And then God provides in that the king wants to know why Nehemiah is sad. And then we move to the next part, and Nehemiah is obedient to ask the king for help. And then God provides because the king gives Nehemiah everything that he asked for. So let's move to the next section, which is verses 9 through 18, which is kind of a big chunk. But really, the main part of this is just Nehemiah traveling all the way to Jerusalem through all those provinces that he had requested letters from the governors for. And he gets to Jerusalem and he starts examining the wall because he needs to see, okay, what exactly am I going to have to do here? How big of a project is this? What needs to be fixed? Where do I start? And he also starts talking to some of the other people in the land and says, this is what the project's going to be. So in this part of the passage, we really kind of get into like the nitty-gritty of the task that God had assigned to Nehemiah. And so Nehemiah's obedience in this portion of the passage is starting the task that God had given him. This is the dirty work. He's like riding on a donkey and he's going around the walls of Jerusalem and he's just seeing what the problem is. He's getting down in the midst of it because this is what God had called him to do. And this is a really big task. If we start reading through all of the verses in the middle here, we see he's going from the valley gate to the dragon spring to the dung gate. And then he goes to the fountain gate into the king's pool. And this is a whole journey around the walls. This is not a one-man job, very clearly. And so Nehemiah is being obedient in starting this task that God has given to him. But then in verse 18, well, really 17 and 18, we see God's provision come in because God provides people to assist Nehemiah in the task. God says, hey, I have given this task to you, but guess what? I've also given you people to help you in it because you're being obedient to me in beginning this work. And so again, the obedience in this passage is that Nehemiah is starting the task that God had given him, but God provides for him in giving him people who are going to work on this task with him. So let's turn back again to our list of character traits that we see in Nehemiah. Do you guys have any thoughts about which of Nehemiah's character traits might contribute to this part of his obedience?
Just want to say real fast, we have 8 minutes and 18 seconds left.
Thank you for the heads up.
I think his trust in God is important here because he is doing this big task, trusting that he'll get it done with the help of God, and he does.
That's good. It even says in verse 16 that no one knew, he hadn't talked to anyone else yet, but he was starting this work with trust in what the Lord had called him to do. Any other thoughts? I didn't say this earlier, but I had the word hopeful written down because he really is looking to the promise that God had given them that he would restore them someday. And I think he's kind of holding on to that same bit of promise here as he looks at these walls that probably looked pretty hopeless. And yet he says, I'm going to start this task because this is what God has called me to do. And so I think we see his hopefulness in that as well.
I think that ties in really well with what Beth said of being trusting. Like, if you trust, you have hope in a way. If you trust God, you have hope. And even when it looks like the walls are completely destroyed, and they are, if you trust God, you have hope that they will not always be that way.
That's good. That's really good. So we are clearly approaching the end of the passage. So let's briefly fly over, recap the last 3 obediences because I feel like my brain's getting a little bit clogged up here. So let's just jump back quickly to the beginning of the story and talk about the first obedience. Remember, Nehemiah comes into the king and he's sad. And so we said that the first obedience was that Nehemiah was honest with his emotions. And then God provided for him someone who cared and wanted to hear what was wrong. And that was the king. And then in the next part of the passage, the obedience that Nehemiah had was to ask the king for help for specific tangible needs. And God provided in that the king gave those things to Nehemiah, everything that he asked for. And then in the section that we just read, Nehemiah's obedience was starting the task that God had given him. And then God provided for him in bringing people alongside him to help with the task. So then the very last section we have here is just the last 2 verses. And honestly, verse 10 kind of gives us a little bit of like a preview of what's coming in these last 2 verses because we meet these 2 guys, Sanballat and Tobiah, and they are just kind of grouchy. They are just not a fan of what's going on here. They're not a fan of Nehemiah. They're not a fan of the walls being rebuilt. And they actually get to the point in verse 19 where they are making fun of the work that's happening. And so in these last 2 verses, in verses 18 and 20, we see the 4th obedience of Nehemiah, which is that he stands up in the face of opposition. He doesn't say, oh no, somebody has come against the work. This is it. I heard incorrectly. God did not call me to rebuild this wall because somebody doesn't want me to do it, so it must not be it. In fact, in verse 20, he even says, the God of heaven will make us prosper. And so we see Nehemiah's obedience in standing in the face of opposition, and then God provides for him in maybe a way that we wouldn't even say, oh yes, that's God's provision, but I think it is. God provides for Nehemiah the trust that God is going to see the work through to the end. We can see Nehemiah's confidence in verse 20. After Sanballat and Tobiah are making fun of him and saying, what are you even doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Nehemiah says to them, the God of heaven will make us prosper, and we his servants will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem. And so this opposition is happening, and Nehemiah obeys God, stands steadfast in the face of that opposition, and God provides for him this confidence in the work that God is going to carry out. And I think we've even seen that provision throughout this story, but it shows up, it's even more dramatic of a highlight in this context when there's this opposition in the form of two actual people who are saying, this is not right. This is not what you should be doing. You guys are idiots for even thinking about it. And Nehemiah says, no, this is what God has called us to. Really brief flyover. I'm going to summarize as quickly as possible. Obedience and provision. We're about to see all four of them rapid fire. In the first section, we see Nehemiah's obedience and honesty with his emotions. And then we see God providing, the king desiring to hear what Nehemiah was sad about. And then we see Nehemiah being obedient to ask the king for what he needed, and God providing in that the king gave Nehemiah everything that he asked for. And then we see Nehemiah being obedient in starting the task that God had called him to do. And then God provided for him people to assist him in the task. And then lastly, we see Nehemiah being obedient to stand in the face of opposition, and God providing for him the confidence that God was going to finish the work that he started. And so we've seen throughout this whole passage over and over again, Nehemiah's character traits led to a lifestyle of obedience. He was obedient to everything that God asked of him in this situation. And every time that he was obedient, God provided for him in crazy ways, miraculous ways. And in that, we see God's fingerprints all over his story. And that's super cool. And guys, I think that also transfers into our lives, because when we are obedient to what God has asked of us, we will see his provision too. And maybe sometimes it looks like the second situation where Nehemiah asked the king for things and the king gave him those things, which is such a clear example of provision. But maybe sometimes it looks like the fourth scenario where the obedience is standing in the face of opposition, and what God provides is confidence that God is going to see that through to the end. And we maybe don't even see exactly what that looks like, but we have that confidence from the Lord. And so what I would like you guys to do today in closing, I know that was such a lot packed into such a short amount of time, but what I would love for you to do is, if you have a piece of paper, which I hope you do because you wrote down character traits of Nehemiah already, you can use the same piece of paper if you want. What I would love for you to do right now is write on a piece of paper something that you feel like God is asking of you in this time of your life. Just write down whatever it is, whatever it might be. It could be anything. It could be sharing the gospel with someone. It could be inviting someone to church. It could be some specific thing that you feel like in your life God is asking of you. But I want you to leave a space, because there's going to be provision associated with that. And so I want you to be able to write that down too when it happens. And then when you write that on the paper, I want you to fold it in half. I want you to put it in your Bible at Nehemiah 2 as a reminder that when we are obedient, God provides for us. Thank you guys so much for coming today. I know that was rapid fire. I really appreciate your time and effort and energy, and I hope that you are able to see God's provision in your lives as you are obedient to what he has asked of you.